Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Landscape Conservation's Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. My name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for the Network for Landscape Conservation. I'm going to share a brief introduction about the network, introduce our speakers very briefly, and then go through some housekeeping rules as we go through this webinar today. So a brief overview of the network. Launched in 2011, the Network for Landscape Conservation is a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation. We really strive to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. And we consider the network really a community as much as an organization, a community that's connected by a shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. We strive to create these opportunities for communities to learn together. And so for this reason, we are really excited to continue this webinar series through the end of this year. So a brief introduction to the individuals who will speak today. I'll just provide their name and they can provide a bit more of an introduction to themselves as they start speaking. We have Susan Holmes from the Wildlands Network, Erin Sito from the Wildlands Network, Dr. Julie Thorstenson from the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, and then Zack Wurtzebach from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. So a few logistics, and then I'll hand it off to Erin. As we listen to the presenters and panelists today, please submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A function on Zoom, and you can see at the bottom of your screen. Once the presenters are done, we'll be using the remaining 15 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. And so with that, I will hand it off to Erin. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kat. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Erin Sito. I'm the U.S. Public Policy Associate for Wildlands Network. For those of you that might not be familiar with Wildlands Network, we are a nonprofit conservation organization. We're comprised of scientists, legal, policy specialists, and very passionate storytellers that are dedicated to reconnecting, rewilding, and restoring North America. We're excited to be celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and so we're excited to kick off those festivities in part by participating in this webinar series. So thank you for joining us for this discussion about the current and potential legal tools in our toolkit to connect to protect habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors. We're very excited to have everybody here. During today's panel, we will first hear from Zack Wurtzebach, who is the Corridors and Crossings Program Director for Center for Large Landscape Conservation. He's going to be talking about the existing legal authorities that the United States Forest Service has at its fingertips to protect and conserve habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors. After that detailed discussion on existing legal authorities, we're going to turn to Susan Holmes, Wildlands Network's Federal Policy Director, and Dr. Julie Thorstenson, the Executive Director of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, and they will both be discussing opportunities that the Biden administration and Congress have to both further protect these corridors. Julie will also discuss some of the work that tribes have been doing to improve connectivity and what types of challenges these initiatives typically face. I want to thank them all again for being here today. We so look forward to hearing about your work. So without further ado, I think I can introduce Zack and ask him to take it away.
Thanks a lot, Erin. Yeah, as Erin mentioned, my name is Zack Wurtzebach. I'm the Corridors and Crossings Program Director at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. We're an NGO based in Bozeman that is really almost completely focused on ecological connectivity. We do a lot of policy work, we do applied science and research, and we convene a lot of collaboration as well as connect networks and in general just facilitate a lot of discussion and work around connectivity. So I'm going to be talking about policy tools and authorities for advancing connectivity conservation in the U.S. Forest Service. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be derived from some recent research we've conducted here, looking at challenges and opportunities for integrating connectivity into forest planning and management. To start off, I'll probably really talk about one of the more foundational legal authorities, which is the National Forest Management Act and planning regulations promulgated under its authority. So next page. So the National Forest Management Act, which is really a foundational piece of legislation for federal forest management, has this one key provision that has been widely litigated, which is to provide for diversity of plant and animal communities based on the suitability and capability of the specific land area in order to meet overall multiple use objectives. So in 2012, when the agency promulgated new regulations under the authority of NIFMA, they basically operationalized this provision using the concept of ecological integrity, which is actually really a guiding concept for planning in general under this 2012 planning rule. So ecological integrity is really kind of a coarse filter approach that emphasizes maintaining and restoring the ecosystem characteristics such as connectivity, and it does get a specific call out, that occur within the natural range of variation that can withstand and recover from anthropogenic or natural disturbances. So all forest plans are required to have planned components to maintain or restore these conditions or key characteristics of ecological integrity. There's also a requirement, and this is kind of the fine filter approach, that forests are required to have plan direction for specific at-risk species and the conditions needed to support them that may not be covered by these broader plan components. For this planning rule is also notable because it really emphasizes a three-part adaptive process of assessment, planning, and monitoring in a continual cycle, and also directs the agency to really take a look outside of its boundaries when it's making planning decisions and doing assessment, to use the best available science and work with partners. All right, next slide. So if we're looking at the specific planning tools that can be used to advance connectivity conservation, there's desired conditions, which are goals basically for, there's objectives, which are measurable, time-specific, often management approaches for meeting DCs. There's standards, which are enforceable constraints on management activity. Guidelines are like standards, but they can vary as long as the purpose of the guideline is met. Suitability is another more enforceable one. It delineates where activities can occur. And forest plans can also have a lot of other content, such as management approaches, which are kind of overall management strategies for achieving desired conditions. The plans are also using a lot of goals now. And then monitoring, again, there are monitoring requirements as well. Monitoring is intended to basically evaluate progress towards achieving goals and track relevant conditions and changes over time. So management areas, and there's also geographic areas, are basically land areas that can be designated within the planning area that have the same set of applicable plan components. So this is basically kind of the key planning toolbox that can be used to advance connectivity. Next slide. So in our kind of review of recent forest plans that have come out under the 2012 rule, we really looked at, started looking for kind of innovations of planning related to connectivity. And there's a couple notable ones. And so one is linkage and connectivity overlays. And these are basically spatially delineated areas that have specific plan components associated with them that often overlay existing management areas. So there's some good examples from the Flathead National Forest here in Montana, as well as the Custer Gallatin do this. Flathead, I think, is really noticeable because it really shows those areas outside of the forest boundary that are important for connectivity. Another important innovation, we see this in the Southwest region, in the Carson Santa Fe forest, is special management areas. And these are management areas that are really where the sole purpose of the management area is to advance habitat and wildlife connectivity. Another one, and this is more on the aquatic side, is conservation watershed networks. Conservation watershed networks are networks of watersheds that have plan components designed to conserve mostly anadromous fish, such as cutthroat trout and intermountain west and other species. And they often have a really strong emphasis on connectivity. And really kind of this network approach is really important in that respect too. Other ones include riparian habitat conservation areas. These are basically delineations of riparian corridors, often that create networks. And some forests have basically expanded those buffers out farther than they might be required to by other regulations. Next page. So despite that, overall, that while there are innovations, generally we're seeing that most planning direction is still really vague and aspirational rather than specific and actionable. So of all the plan components we look at, only 21% are really specific in relation to like a geographic area, a habitat, a time frame, or a species. It's really just large general goals for connectivity rather than anything specific and actionable. You can also see that in kind of the breakdown of plan components that address connectivity. Most are desired conditions and guidelines or management approaches. Very few are really enforceable standards or guidelines. Next page. So in talking to agency staff and partners, one reason for this is that a lot of agency staff are really unwilling to commit to really specific and particularly geographic specific direction, giving the potential for changing conditions. And a lot of this has to do, particularly in the West, with the explosive growth we've seen in high severity wildfires. For example, the early adopters in the Sierra had really been focusing on identifying linkage areas and core habitat for fisher, which is a threatened species. And in 2019, a lot of those linkage areas burned up. So forest staff are seeing this, and it's one reason they're a little hesitant to be super specific and actionable. Another issue is a lot of forest planners at the forest level are just unaware of relevant connectivity science, or there isn't relevant connectivity science that meets the criteria for best available scientific information, or they may not know how to craft effective connectivity plan components. Another key issue is lack of commitment and interest from line officers. A great example of this is actually on the Rio Grande. So the Carson National Forest, which created a special management area, that's that shaded area there. Well, right across the border is the Rio Grande National Forest. And there was hope, because the Rio Grande National Forest was going through a plan revision as well, that they would adopt a similar special management area, particularly as this area that connects Colorado and New Mexico and these two forests is a really important area for wildlife movement. But the forest supervisor and staff basically decided not to, and for various reasons. But having this consistency across forests, a real key barrier is the fact that it does come down to that individual line officer at the forest level. Another issue is just lack of capacity for coordinating connectivity efforts across units and with neighboring landowners. And one thing we heard from a lot of agency staff is a lot of times the key challenges for connectivity really outside the forest boundaries. But they don't have capacity to really work with or getting anything enforceable with other agencies or other landowners. Next page. So I'll come back to kind of some of those specific challenges in a minute, but I think it's also really important to note that there's a lot of other important authorities and tools that are relevant for advancing connectivity, particularly on the management and restoration side when we look at getting work done to advance connectivity. So one, obviously, is the National Environmental Policy Act. There is a real trend in the agency, I think, where we're starting to see more movement toward these kind of larger programmatic NEPA analyses. And there's a real opportunity here, both for integrating connectivity considerations into the effects analysis, as well as making sure that for some things, maybe some actions you're mitigating to make sure and building in mitigation requirements to protect connectivity, as well as just overall having management strategies for advancing it. So I think one great example of a big NEPA that can advance connectivities in the aquatic realm, and that's with the Pacific Northwest Regional Aquatic Restoration EA. That's really streamlined and create a lot of efficiencies for getting aquatic restoration work done on the ground that really helps improve aquatic connectivity. Another one is shared stewardship, and this is an agency initiative that's really been pushed forward under the Good Neighbor Authority in the Farm Bill, which basically supports contracting and coordination with federal and state entities on forest management. A lot of agency staff said there's a great opportunity here, both the legal authority, but also as an agency initiative that emphasizes collaboration with state partners. And for example, the shared stewardship MOU in Colorado really had specific attention and emphases on protecting and enhancing wildlife corridors. Next slide. Obviously, some other ones coming down is a lot of the funding that's being provided through the Legacy Roads and Trails and Infrastructure Act. It's related to NEPA, it's related to programmatic action, but really it's going to be a lot of money that can support and be used to improve aquatic organism passage for aquatic species and construct wildlife crossings. Another kind of regulatory toehold on the transportation side is travel management planning. The travel management planning is a process, it's really tiered to the forest planning process, but it's also kind of a standalone thing and has its own regulatory authority. And there's real opportunities there. We've heard from folks for integrated connectivity considerations into decisions related to motorized recreation, where and when you might have it, as well as road decommissioning. Next slide. All right, and other ones that are really important is funding from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And this is particularly important for the Federal Lands Acquisition Program in the Forest Service, which is used to acquire private land to be incorporated into the National Forest System. And a great example of both LCW, LWCF funding and the authorities this program is derived from is in acquiring land that's been used to really connect and create a wildlife corridor in Florida, the Ocala Wildlife Corridor. Another key one is the Forest Legacy Fund. This is another one that really requires collaboration with states as well as entities like land trusts. In places like Vermont, this is a cost share program, but a lot of this funding has gone to getting easements that can really conserve connectivity, such as the Northern Green Mountain linkage, which connects really key piece of habitat in northern Vermont. Next slide. All right, so moving forward, I think there are some real opportunities for more systematically integrating connectivity considerations into planning and other agency initiatives. So right off the bat, one easy thing that the Washington office could do and regional office could do with the support of partners is really start putting together, connectivity training materials and tools, existing science, examples of good plan components, having webinars and training for forest planning and specialists. Another thing that would be relatively easy to do administratively is integrate connectivity criteria into federal lands acquisitions processes. However, that program will need to be adequately staffed. Right now, it's a very understaffed program, and I don't believe they have the bandwidth to really develop new criteria or processes or integrate science effectively into some of these acquisitions decisions. Moving forward, the really big opportunities are going to be associated with investment in kind of higher level analytical capacity for forest planning. So the agency is currently, it appears, really trying to think about moving to a new planning model where a lot of the analytical capacity and heavy lifting will be centralized at regional or higher scales. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, particularly if there's additional money coming down for investment planning, for building capacity for an investment in science management partnerships to develop new connectivity products that are, broad range, wide ranging across multiple units. There's also opportunities for standardized plan components for connectivity. You could have regionally consistent plan direction. In some regions are already moving this way. And there's also, maybe potentially opportunities for developing, regional plan amendments, although there's maybe not capacity right now for that. But overall, moving forward, I think investment in kind of regional level planning is really important. And this is both for doing programmatic NEPA and getting management done, prioritizing where you're going to allocate resources using some of these new funding streams, et cetera. So anyway, I guess maybe it's more of a hope that the agency will start thinking about more regionally coordinated efforts in this respect. And I think that's next slide. I think that's pretty much it. I want to go too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate your input. And as always, I feel like we could talk about Forest Service issues the rest of the day and probably still not have enough time. So to be continued on these discussions for sure. So before turning to our next speaker, I'd just like to cue up her discussion really quickly with this one slide. So across the country, states have been leading the charge on passing meaningful legislation, resolutions, and enacting executive orders to protect and restore wildlife corridors and habitat connectivity hotspots. And with each state, they really do tackle this issue in a variety of ways. And just to provide a few examples, in Oregon in 2019, they passed legislation, but it's really focused on crossings for roadways. So they wanted to improve landscape permeability and public safety on the roadways. They went with wildlife crossings route. In Wyoming, they went more species specific. They have an executive order that was passed or enacted, that focuses on mule deer specific corridors. In Vermont, as Zach was talking about, they enacted a review, or they passed legislation in 2016 for a review of their forest planning statutes to promote continuous areas of forest land from fragmentation, and also to promote habitat connectivity within those or in between those existing forest lands. And most recently, we have the Florida legislation that was passed this last summer, and that bill's tasked its state agencies with the duty to both acquire land within the Florida wildlife corridor and to work with landowners to create incentives that bolster wildlife migration across private lands, among other things. And in addition to that bill, the state also decided to set aside an additional $300 million federal dollars from the American Rescue Plan to support this initiative. So looking at this map, you see that there's some states highlighted in dark blue. Those are the states that have passed some sort of legislation or resolution or executive order. But I also just wanted to highlight that these states in light blue are states that have either have introduced legislation now or continue to try and push for habitat, connectivity, and wildlife corridor legislation. So the response to this wildlife need at the state level has been overwhelming, and it's really only growing. I think that really cues us up well to Susan's presentation, because we can only hope that this enthusiasm for this work will be echoed at the federal level. So Susan has been working hand in hand with members of the Biden administration, as well as a coalition of other interested conservation stakeholders to incorporate connectivity initiatives into the congressional and administrative wildlife conservation agendas. Thank you for the work you do, Susan. We are excited to hear about your presentation.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you everyone at NCL for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the federal opportunities for wildlife corridors and connectivity. As Erin was saying, this is an amazing time to be working on this issue. When I started in Washington, D.C., working for the Wildlands Network as their federal policy director in 2014, this issue was just beginning to bubble up, and it's been an extraordinary ride to see how much traction it's gained politically and how much support it now has within Congress and in the Biden administration. Next slide. Well, I thought I'd start this presentation with a little bit of good news and looking at something that has recently happened that I think is a game changer in many places across the country and for our federal landscapes. As you all know, roads are one of the greatest impediments to wildlife movement and to landscape permeability. And we recently, in the infrastructure bill that just passed, Congress, $350 million of dedicated funding for wildlife crossings was incorporated into that legislation. And this is truly a game changer for wildlife on the landscape. This is the first time that we've seen dedicated funding for crossings in a transportation bill, and really funding of scale to be able to make the difference. And as Erin was saying, for those states that are now planning and hoping to invest in wildlife connectivity, this is really important funding. I want to flag a little bit of the value of this for not just for roads, but also for some critical spaces, wild and large landscapes that really need these very important crossings. A couple that come to mind that you may all be somewhat familiar with, for example, I-70 in Colorado, Vail Pass, where the Eagle's Nest Wilderness and the White River National Forest sort of are bisected by I-70, is a perfect example of the kind of place that could really use this kind of funding. Another important example is in the Pigeon River Gorge and I-40 in North Carolina, where the Great Smoky National Park and the Cherokee National Forest, again, are bifurcated by this road that creates impediment for elk and bears, et cetera. So these are the kinds of projects that we hope to see that will flow from this funding, and just very excited that this is now going to be available starting for the next 5 years, starting in FY22. And you'll see that eligible applicants include the list that is there, but also partners can receive these funds. And those partners include foundations and NGOs and academic institutions, as well as tribes and state government entities. So a really exciting development, and one that's going to have, I think, meaning on the landscape for wildlife and wild places. Next slide. Well, I wanted to talk about something that is not yet happened, but we are very hopeful will happen in the near future. And again, this could be a real game changer for wildlife corridors and connectivity. As Zack was saying, the federal agencies have many, many tools to protect wildlife corridors and the forest planning, et cetera. But what we've seen, I think, is that wildlife connectivity has not really become a priority for the wildlife management agencies as of yet. So the goal with this bill, which I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about, is to do just that, is to make wildlife connectivity a priority for planning for our land and also water management. A little bit of history about the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. It was first introduced by Congressman Don Beyer in 2016, a Democrat from Virginia, but then gained bipartisan support and was co-sponsored by Representative Vern Buchanan of Florida, who loves wildlife corridors. You can see how popular corridors are in Florida, and several other Republicans. The bill has passed in the House twice, in 2020 and 2021, both incorporated into the infrastructure bills. So it's done very, very well in the House. It was introduced in the Senate by Senator Tom Udall in 2019, and we are working actively to try to build bipartisan support and in the Senate before we introduce it again, before they introduce it again. And we're guardedly hopeful that we're going to see some real traction in the Senate in 2022 for this legislation. It's a comprehensive bill to protect wildlife corridors on federal public lands. It also supports connectivity on state, tribal, and on private lands, and I'll go a little bit into that as well. It covers a whole range of wildlife, not just limited to migrating game species, but also fish, aquatics, monarch butterflies, et cetera, even plants are covered under the bill, and it's received a lot of broad support from scientists such as E.O. Wilson, et cetera, outdoor recreation, and hundreds of NGOs at this point. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit about the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, and specifically the federal and tribal piece. You'll see here the path of the pronghorn, which is the only federally designated wildlife corridor that was designated as part of a forest plan. That model is really sort of at the heart of the federal side of the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. It has been sort of the inspiration for how wildlife corridor planning would work, that you would plan around the needs of a species or multiple species and identify and then protect or possibly designate a wildlife corridor for the needs of that species in the process of federal management planning. Some of the other highlights of the bill: it fosters collaboration among key agencies. This is something that we've seen again and again, that real need to have the BLM talking to the Forest Service, talking to the Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera, et cetera. That is something that is really a priority of the legislation. It recognizes the important role that partnerships play. And again, with the path of the pronghorn, what has been so helpful and so successful about that has been the local support and the role that partnerships have had. So it both encourages partnerships to propose wildlife corridors, and it also integrates partnerships into the planning process. It recognizes, again, also that science and that need that Zack talked about to have more information and knowledge about wildlife corridors is key. So in addition to identifying the wildlife corridors, it actively provides funds and support to create a wildlife corridor database that would be broadly shared. And then I know that my colleague Julie's going to be talking about the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act, but it also includes the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act. Next slide. So we all know, though, that wildlife corridors don't only occur on federal public lands. They also are on private lands, state lands, and that need is recognized in the legislation as well, with a section of the bill which creates a wildlife movement grant program for states and tribes and other entities. And that program would supply needed money, $50 million at least in the House bill, possibly more in the Senate bill, we'll see, for a grant program for habitat connectivity on non-federal lands. The grants would be administered by NIFWF, or National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And there are a suite of eligible recipients. We recognize that this is a really important and critical role that we want to engage landowners, state agencies, Indian tribes, NGOs, again, and coming back to those collaborative partnerships, hoping to incentivize and fund those collaborative partnerships, which are so important. Next slide. So then I want to talk a little bit about what's happening with the Biden administration, which has been really wonderful in terms of their prioritization of wildlife corridors. As many of you have seen, the America the Beautiful initiative, which seeks to conserve 30% of lands and waters by 2030, actually has as a priority, and I have the language here in the slide, but expand collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats and corridors. So we were so heartened to see that. And you can see some of that specific language below that they also have in that report. I mean, we have been very lucky that the last few years has seen strong support out west through the secretarial order on big game migration that was first initiated by the previous administration. And that success, the administration, I think, is really looking to build on. And we're encouraging that and very excited about taking both that model and expanding on it in terms of the geography and the breadth of species, but also going beyond that. And turn to the next slide. So we know that the Biden administration will be receiving more funding, hopefully, with the infrastructure bill. For sure, there's over $2 billion for ecosystem restoration. And then the budget resolution bill, the Build Back Better bill, which is now pending in Congress, also has significant funding for ecosystem resilience and ecosystem restoration. With that new funding and also the imperative, I think, to implement the America the Beautiful initiative, a group of conservation organizations working on wildlife connectivity and corridors have put together a wildlife corridor action plan for the Biden administration. And just highlighting a couple of the things that we are talking to the administration about and we think are absolutely imperative for them to do in the short term. And again, following very much on what Zack has said, there's a huge need, I think, for additive resources and specifically executive direction to prioritize wildlife corridors and connectivity. So we're asking the Biden administration, one, to focus on the identification of wildlife corridors by beefing up that science and providing technical assistance to non-federal partners such as tribes and NGOs, et cetera, so that we can do that kind of analysis and research and get the information to identify where these corridors are. And with that information in mind, then provide executive direction to the agencies to then go out and identify where those corridors are on federal lands. The other piece is the important collaboration and coordination. We've seen again and again that there's this real need for the agencies to talk together and to collaborate on wildlife corridors and connectivity. And we're hopeful that they will initiate an interagency management body or some kind of executive body that will begin to sort of foster that kind of collaboration that we really need, that active collaboration. And then finally, in the near term, we are hopeful that as Zack's research has pointed out, that the planning and guidance and research documents can be updated to include wildlife corridors and connectivity. That seems to be a place where with the kind of executive direction that the Biden administration could give would really be beneficial in order to jumpstart what has been a long needed process to get wildlife corridors and connectivity, again, more fully incorporated into the planning by the land management agencies. So that gives you just a little bit of a snapshot of what we're doing here in Washington, D.C. to try to ensure that wildlife corridors are prioritized both within the Biden administration and through legislation. We're guardedly hopeful we'll see real movement in the Senate for a wildlife corridors bill, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Susan. That is always great to get a recap of all the things that we've been doing to try and usher this along. So thank you so much. Building off that discussion, Julie Thorstenson is here to talk with us about the Tribal Wildlife Corridor Bill, wildlife conservation initiatives, and connectivity priorities that all the different tribes are working on, as well as some of the challenges and opportunities that come up when we're working in these different areas. So Julie, please jump right in.
Ihani washte Julie Thorstenson and Machiapi, Woksapi Kiglu Hamni Wan Lakota Machiapi, Me Lakota, Wakpa washte Taha, Dayahiye, Chante washte, Itancha Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Julie Thorstenson. My Lakota name is She Carries Her Wisdom with Her. I am Lakota and a citizen of the Shiner Sioux Nation in North Central South Dakota. I'm also the Executive Director for Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. I'm really happy to be here and thank you for this opportunity to talk about tribes and specifically corridors and connectivity. Next slide, please. For those of you that don't know or are not familiar with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, a national tribal organization founded in 1983. Our mission is to assist Native American and Alaska Native tribes with the conservation, protection, and enhancement of their fish and wildlife resources. Next slide, please. We have 7 regions and we have 227 support member tribes, meaning we have resolutions of support from 227 individual tribes. We also have individual membership, and most of our membership consists of people working in Indian country or working for tribes, are partnering with tribes in capacities as conservation officers, biologists, technicians, etc. Next slide, please. So you may not be aware, but tribes own or influence the management of nearly 140 million acres. And that includes more than 730,000 acres of lakes and reservoirs, 10,000 miles of streams and rivers, and 18 million acres of forests. So these lands and waters provide habitat for fish and wildlife, including more than 500 species listed as threatening and are endangered. Next, please. I think it's really important to discuss how tribal fish and wildlife programs are funded. Tribes are excluded from excise taxes, the Pittman Robertson and Dingell Johnson funds that primarily fund the states. A lot of tribes will use Public Law 93-638 funding, which is Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, where they can contract certain functions from the federal government, such as the natural resources programs. Unfortunately, these funds have not really seen an increase, a substantial increase forever. And also we rely on tribal wildlife grants, which were created through the state and tribal wildlife grant program and are administered through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And, you know, they've been around for about 20 years. I think it is important, though, to talk about how tribes are included. The state wildlife grant program was established in 2000, and it authorizes formula-based funding for states, territories, and Commonwealth, and the District of Columbia. That's based on land size and population. And in 20 years, Fish and Wildlife Service has awarded about $1 billion through those state wildlife grants, formula grants. And then the tribal wildlife grant was established the next year in 2001 with funds distributed through a competitive award process to federally recognized tribes. And the maximum grant award amount for those grants is $200,000. And since 2002, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has awarded $99 million through the TWIG, providing support for about 538 projects in Indian country. In contrast, the state wildlife grant program was created by Congress in 2007 with funds distributed through a competitive awards to states, territories, and Commonwealth. And their maximum award, grant award is $1 million, and they've been awarded about $67 million per fiscal year. So you can see there's definitely some inequity in that funding. Also, just a reminder that there are 574 federally recognized tribes. Other ways that tribes fund their fish and wildlife programs include hunting and fishing license revenue, but that really varies on the tribe's resources and also their management and their overall feelings on hunting and fishing, as far as licensing. And then other tribal funds such as land lease or casino funds, and then through grants. Next slide, please. So tribal fish and wildlife programs in Indian country are very diverse. Our smallest program is a half-time employee that is housed through a tribal police department and also is their conservation law enforcement officer. You know, if you don't have the funding, it's really hard to sustain people and also recruit and retain. Another issue is the infamous other duties as assigned. So we see tribes that are really understaffed and not at full capacity, and they're doing several other duties range. We've been seeing during the pandemic, a lot of our conservation staff were helping with testing and food distribution. So next slide, please. So now the topic, wildlife corridors in Indian country. I think one thing to understand is there is not one Indigenous perspective on wildlife migration. I've actually had that question more than once, people asking for the Indigenous perspective, and you have to remember that these are unique sovereign nations, and so they all have different landscapes and different histories and different jurisdictions. But I think the biggest thing that I would say is that relationships and communication is really key when talking about wildlife corridors. There is a lot of work going on in Indian country around corridors. You just might not be hearing about it. One prime example is, you know, the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe in Montana are really at the forefront of connectivity and corridors with the People's Way project or the Animals Bridge, where, you know, in the early 2000s, Confederate Salish Kootenai tribe in Montana led and directed efforts to achieve mitigation through these wildlife underpass crossing structures, and then the one large overpass, which is known as the Animals Bridge on US Highway 93. Next, please. So I've talked about lack of capacity and challenges. I think it's important to understand the challenges of engaging tribes, because as I said, they are doing the work. A lot of them are doing it with less resources and definitely lack of capacity. So imagine being a one person department. And the other realities is sometimes really hard to get fish and wildlife priorities to the top of the tribal government's list, especially when they're systemically underfunded. And specifically now during the COVID pandemic, tribes have really been focused on that. Another factor to consider is state-tribal relations. Some tribes work hand in hand with states and have property management plans, and some even have cross-deputization of officers, while others just do not work well together. They have a history that they just are unable to really get to that place where they can mutually work together. Another example is contradicting management goals with the state and tribal game and fish departments, and then connecting with the right person. Most communication will start with the tribal leadership, the president or the chairman, which is the proper process, but it does take a while for things to trickle down to the person that maybe is doing the on the ground work. And when you're talking about an underfunded, undercapacity program, you also have to remember that there should be a benefit for the tribe. So a lot of tribes I work with describe being asked for input, but then not being included in final outcomes. Next, please. So federal policy and tribal inclusion, there really must be, tribes must be part of it. And talking about, Susan talked about Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. I'll touch a little bit on the separate Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act, and then talk about some of the funding around tribal corridors, and also just some of the fish and wildlife funding that we're seeing as a priority. Next, please. So Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act and the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act, we have been supporting the protection of wildlife corridors at the NAFWS since 2019. We passed a resolution, and we recognize the importance that these bills need, to sustain the funding streams for planning and other capacity that's needed to address wildlife and habitat connectivity. the funding would allow tribes to hire professional staff, purchase collars, collect and analyze migration data. And one of the problems with participating is lack of data is a prohibiting factor for tribes to participate in wildlife connectivity. So just being able to collect the data is an issue. Next, please. So the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is an excellent resource and funds many different conservation programs. The annual grant cycle is good for tribes. It allows for planning in advance. It's not a 30 or 90-day turnaround expectation. That's what we find a lot of times with grants is our funding, it comes out and you have a 30-day turnaround, and that's really unrealistic and for tribes to turn that around because of the levels of approval that they have to go through, and just again being able to find the manpower to work on that. And again, you know, building relationships is and communication with tribes is really key, and increasing outreach and communication to tribes. The one-to-one non-federal match can be a barrier for tribes to meet based on several of the challenges already discussed. Next, please. So the Secretarial Order 3362, in its current form, it is exclusive of tribes except in specific circumstances. And state action plans must identify tribal lands in their priority areas, and state agencies need to sign off on tribal lands. I think this has been rectified in the last request for proposals through NFWF. But previously, you know, like I stated, some tribes and states do not have a relationship, and as well, so that just having to have a state sign off on tribal funding can be a barrier. It can be done. The Southern Ute Tribe has accessed 3362 funding for 2 projects in Southwest Colorado. There's also kind of a catch-22 where the tribes need the funding to collect the data to access the funding. So, you know, we've been encouraged. There seems to be some positive changes in this last funding cycle that that is more user-friendly for tribes. Next, please. And then hopefully you all saw the hearing yesterday in the Senate EPW Committee on Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This is something that we've really been working on hard for quite a few years. You know, I think for the first time, to my knowledge, tribes were included at the beginning of this instead of at the end. A lot of times we see that tribes are kind of an afterthought, but there is a tribal title in Recovering America's Wildlife Act that dedicates $97.5 million for tribal fish and wildlife programs. And that's really critical. It's annual dedicated secure funding. It definitely would be a game changer for tribes. It would help us build capacity and also help to start to remedy some of the funding inequity that we see in fish and wildlife funding. And we've had lots of support from tribes. We had 81 signatures on a letter we sent to Senate that represented 114 tribes in 23 states. And we also have resolutions from many intertribal organizations, such as the National Congress of American Indians, NAFWS, the Associated Tribes of Northwest Indians, the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, and the United Southern and Eastern Tribes. Next slide, please. So one other opportunity is through the state wildlife action plans. I think this is really an opportunity to develop partnerships. You know, fish and wildlife, they really don't care where our political boundaries are. They want to be able to move. So we've been working on this as well in this past year and finding that some states have already included tribes in state wildlife action plans. And it really is an opportunity. It, of course, is beneficial for the species. It can aid in increased research. It's an opportunity to include traditional ecological knowledge and also to learn from each other for best practices. Next, please. And of course, President Biden, one of the first actions he took was the memorandum on January 26th regarding Executive Order 13175, which is to reiterating the importance of the U.S. trust responsibility to tribal nations and to strengthen the nation-to-nation relationship between the United States and Indian tribes and promoting self-governance. Stating, you know, the need for engaging in regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal officials in the development of federal policies that have tribal implications. Just kind of also on the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act, We did see some change from the 116th to 117th version. In the 116th, there was $5 million dedicated to tribes, and the 117th, there's 50 million, which is much more realistic than trying to split a pot of $5 million between all the tribes that are working on corridors. Next, please. So one thing I also wanted to talk about is just lack of responses, not necessarily apathy. I get asked a lot in my position on how to engage tribes or partner, and I'm often hear, you know, we tried to call or we tried to reach out and we didn't hear anything. I think it's just important to take into account some of the challenges tribes deal with and understand that silence is not apathy. So there are 574 unique tribal nations, and it's really important to build relationships and know the key people. And remember that intertribal organizations can help to get the information out. And there is work being done on wildlife migration in Indian country, but communication of that might not be out there. But just some examples I've already talked about: the Confederate Salish Kootenai tribes in Montana, the Southern Indian tribe in Colorado, and then the Burns Paiute tribe in Oregon. And I think just we held a listening session at the beginning of the year with tribes. There are 233 tribes that are included in the area of the Secretary Order 3362. And we sent out emails and invited them to a listening session. And we had about 50 tribes participate. And we were really blown away just to find the work that they're doing. And I think one of the things that the reality in Indian country is listening to some of the tribes talk about their planning for wildlife connectivity and wildlife corridors, and having to plan on like a 20-year scale because they know that the funding is going to be so hard to get. We have one tribe that has 2 ranches that they purchased and then forest land in the middle of it, and they've been working on doing 8 corridor projects, and they've definitely got it staggered out very far into the future just because they realize that securing the funding is such an issue. So I think with Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act, and hopefully with Recovering American Wildlife Act, and just some of the other funding that we're seeing for tribes specifically, that hopefully that will help to build the capacity so tribes are able to be at the table when these conversations are happening. And we will continue to work on wildlife connectivity and corridors as one of our initiatives. We just hired a wildlife connectivity coordinator that will begin in January, and we continue it into our 2022 national initiatives. And with that, I think I have one more slide with my contact info, or probably all of our, yeah. So thank you very much for the time, and I would take any questions. Bilami.
Thank you so much, Julie. Really appreciate you giving us that rundown of how it all works. I really think that is so helpful for everyone to hear. As far as questions go, I know the Cat is going to be fielding some questions from the group chat, but I just want to flag that Julie does have to leave right at 1 o'clock. So maybe we get any questions to Julie that are asked of her first.
That sounds great. Thank you, Erin. And thank you all of the presenters. This has been great. We are running low on time, so we may only get to a few questions, but let me see if I can pull up any from for Julie, since I know she has to leave first. So one question that came up while Julie was talking was, do you have recommendations on the first things to think about or first steps to help heal relationships that may have been strained due to past actions taken by state and federal agencies or NGOs in conservation work when you're reaching out to communities?
Is that question for me?
Yeah, you can take it first, and if there's any other folks who have comments on that.
I think it's just building genuine relationships and not coming in with an agenda and listening. You know, there's, like I said, there's just been there is a lot of work that's been done in Indian country, especially around fish and wildlife. Tribes have a unique relationship with fish and wildlife, especially the fish and wildlife that is surrounding them. It's what they subsisted on for time immemorial. So I think just asking questions and trying to understand that if you work with one tribe, you know one tribe. So you need to really take the time to get to know the people that you're working with, and make sure that you're respectful and just try to be honest and genuine with your relationship.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. And so this is a bit of a broader question that hopefully everyone can touch on very briefly, since I know we're running low on time. But what are some recommendations you have for NGO collaborators who want to move forward both at the local scale and at the large scale for connectivity projects on federally managed lands in collaboration with land managers? And the second is, what are best opportunities to work at the forest level with forest level staff who have limited capacity? So any of you who would like to respond to that?
Hey, this is Zack Wurtzebach here. Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of two things with the engagement and on the Forest Service stuff. I mean, it is true the Forest Service staff do have limited capacity, and I think one of just the really critical opportunities, particularly around planning, is being visible and kind of reaching out early in the planning process. I think integrating connectivity considerations, and I think I can touch a little bit on a question Jonathan Haber posed, which just about reluctance to engage in connectivity due to concerns around private property and things like that. And I think that is a really, that's still there, and where you do see things like connectivity considerations getting integrated, it's because there's, strong, there's leadership on the Forest Service side who's taken an interest in it, but also, NGOs who've reached out and who've made it very clear they like to provide capacity, and also who do a lot of organizing to really push for these things. So again, I think it is tricky to navigate that, but reaching out, letting them know you're there, and then also letting them know you have capacity to provide, I think is really important. So it's not easy, but yeah.
Thanks, Zach. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Okay, great. And a little bit more of a simple answer for feedback from you all, but through which agency or agencies is the funding for the Wildlife Crossing pilot program available? I think people are very interested in that program.
Sure, that's through the Department of Transportation, and they will be sending out, I'm happy to provide the link. They've set up a website with information available right now as they start to develop the guidelines for that grant program. That's not, that we expect that to be forthcoming in the next month or two. So a lot of people I know are really eager to take advantage of that opportunity, and I'm happy to provide the preliminary grant website to the group at CAT. You might be able to share, and if there's further questions, happy to field those. But the information about how that money is going to be distributed is outside of the bounds of the legislation, which I can share with you for sure, is now being developed.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. Really appreciate it. I think we are just about the hour. Let me see if I can find one more question to pitch to everybody. And please continue to add your questions. Just so you know, the panelists will get these questions, and if there's any follow-up, they're able to reach out to folks. Let me see if there's one more. Yeah, and if there's any other questions, please, like I said, reach out to the panelists. We have all the contact information. I don't see any easy questions to respond to in the short period of time right now, but I just wanted to kind of wrap up a bit and thank all the panelists for their time. We've just about reached that hour, so thank you all for really just sharing your knowledge and letting us learn from you today. This webinar is just part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. And a recording of this webinar will be available on the network website next week. And you can access all the previous webinars on that website. And I will drop the link to our website here. And you'll also get a follow-up email with all of that information to kind of digest all the great information we got today. And that'll have all the slides, etc. And I just also wanted to highlight there's upcoming webinars next year in 2022. On Tuesday, January 11th at 1, we'll have a presentation by Upstream's Tech's lens. It's focused on using remote assessment for landscape conservation. And there's more information on the website, but that is a web application that supports organizations in monitoring and assessing protected areas, restoration projects, and working lands. So as always, thank you all so much for attending. We are extremely grateful for all your time and participation in the webinar series. Really great chat conversations going on throughout this presentation. And thank you all to the presenters for sharing your knowledge. It was incredibly informative. And thank you for making the time in this busy end of the year rush. Again, thank you all so much from the Network for Landscape Conservation, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks all, and have a good one.